Good morning. This presentation will focus on the acquisition of infinitival constructions in Portuguese as a second language by Spanish native speakers. In particularly, we will focus on the acquisition of the prepositional infinitival construction as a complement of perception verbs. And the motivation for this topic lies firstly on the fact that both Portuguese and Spanish make available a set of different non-finite complement structures of perception verbs, but these structures have different syntactic and semantic properties. Crucially, the PIC is available in Portuguese but not in Spanish. But first, we will look into an example of the PIC. So here in 1A and 1B, we have two instances of PIC. And as we can see, this structure is characterized by the fact that it has an accusative subject, followed by an aspectual head, this preposition a, and then an infinitival verb form that can be either uninflected or inflected. So as I said, Portuguese and Spanish make available a set of structures as complements of perception verbs, and in this table we have a synthesis of these structures. So we will focus on the PIC, which is comparable to the gerund construction that is available in Spanish, but not in Portuguese. And we will talk a little bit about the properties of these two structures. The gerund construction is also available in Portuguese in this context, but not in the standard variety. So it is only available in the southern varieties and in some insular dialects. Then we have three other infinitival structures, the complex predicate, ECM, and the inflected infinitive structure. Two of them, ECM and the complex predicate, are available in Portuguese and Spanish, but the inflected infinitive only in Portuguese. These structures differ from the PIC and the gerund also in the fact that they are available with perception, but also with causative verbs. The PIC and the gerund construction are only available with perception verbs. And we have again the example of the PIC, and here we can compare it with the gerund construction from Spanish. And as we can see, the gerund construction also has an accusative subject, but with differential object marking. It has a morphological marking preceding the noun, plus a gerund verb form and not an infinitive. Now, some notes, a few notes are important. First, regarding the PIC, it seems this structure seems to be preferred by Portuguese speakers, both adults and children, as a complement of perception verbs, as shown in a previous study by Santos Gonçalves and Iams. And regarding the differential object marking in Spanish, it is important to say that this is a general property of Spanish that affects accusative constituents that are associated to semantic features such as animated and specific. Similarly, we can also found leísmo in some dialects that consists in the use of a dative clitic pronoun in an accusative context. And this is also associated with the semantic feature animated, but especially the feature of human. Now, previous studies on non-native acquisition show that Spanish native speakers may show persistent transfer effects of the properties of differential object marking in the acquisition of Brazilian Portuguese. So it is important to keep this in mind in this study. Previous analyses of the PIC and the gerund construction have focused on the progressive spectral value of these two structures, so they express non-combinated events. They are also traditionally analyzed as small clauses. The PIC, as we have seen, has an spectral head, the preposition a, and this preposition has been analyzed as a preposition of central coincidence. A recent analysis by Casalicchio has proposed a unified analysis of the PIC and the gerund construction. This author argues that in both structures, the progressive spectral value is encoded in the preposition a, but in the gerund construction, the preposition is null and incorporated in the verb form. Now, regarding the SLA framework that we follow in this study, we follow the feature reassembly hypothesis as proposed by Lardier. And this hypothesis focuses on the process of acquisition of features and their configuration in feature bundles associated with different morpholexical representations in the L1 and the L2. According to this hypothesis, the acquisition process will develop in two main tasks. The first one is mapping, and in this stage, learners associate specific L1 feature combinations with the L2 configurations that are perceived as closest to the ones of their L1. Then in the reassembling stage, we have more complex operations. So speakers may need to add features that are relevant in the L2 but not in the L1, or on the contrary, avoid features that are relevant only in their L1 but not in the L2. But also they may have to reassemble features with different configurations in the L1 and in the L2. Studies that have focused on the feature reassembly hypothesis have explored the possibility that these different operations may be associated with different levels of complexity. So Montreux and Yoon propose that avoiding features or acquiring different configurations of a feature available in the L1 and the L2 may be a more complex task than adding features relevant only in the L2. In the same line, Cho and Slavakova argued that acquiring a difference in feature configuration involving overt versus covert realization may add complexity to the acquisition process. In this work, it will also be explored the possibility of complementarity between different SLA hypotheses. In this case, we will explore the complementarity between the feature reassembly hypothesis and the L1 preemption hypothesis, taking into consideration its most recent formulation by Iverson and Rothman. So L1 preemption corresponds to a context in which the acquisition of new L2 properties does not entail the removal of the competing L1 structure for the same domain from the L2 interlanguage. Now, L1 preemption is sensitive to typological and structural similarities between languages, and this is very important in this study since we are studying Portuguese and Spanish. Iverson and Rothman also argue that the feature reassembly hypothesis and the L1 preemption hypothesis may apply simultaneously and differentially depending on the language pair and the target L2 property. In fact, they argue that when the acquisition of an L property entails some more complex tasks, this creates a context that is more prone to the observation of L1 preemption effects. So considering the properties of the two structures and the SLA framework that has been discussed so far, what does it imply for Spanish learners of Portuguese to acquire the PIC? So regarding mapping, these speakers will have to identify that the two languages have a complement of perception verbs that expresses a progressive spectral value. So there is a structure in both languages that has a progressive feature. And this complement is analyzed as a small clause in the two languages. Then they would have to reassemble the spectral feature because it has different morphological counterparts in the two languages. So as we have seen in Spanish, the spectral value or feature is encoded in a gerund verb form. It might have a covert realization of the preposition of or spectral head. But in the European Portuguese, the spectral value is realized by the preposition plus the infinitival verb form. So our research question is this. So is acquiring PIC a challenge for Spanish L1 speakers due to possible difficulties in mapping and reassembling the features associated to different morphosyntactic counterparts to the same spectral value in Portuguese and in Spanish? So we hypothesize that the fact that the progressive spectral value is encoded in different counterparts in the two languages entails a complex task from the point of view of the acquisition. What is more, the PIC in Portuguese may have an infinitival verb form that can be inflected or uninflected, but even if it is inflected, dominative subject is not licensed. And the L1 grammar has available other types of infinitival complement structures that are also possible in the L2, namely the ECM structure. And this structure may be perceived as sufficient to account for the input of the L2, despite the fact that they do not convey the same spectral value. And if this hypothesis holds, we will observe L1 preemption effects. But why is ECM a possibility for L1 preemption effects? Here, in these examples, we can compare PIC in Portuguese with ECM in Portuguese and in Spanish. And as we can see on the surface, these structures differ by the presence or absence of this spectral head, the preposition a. Both structures have an accusative embedded subject in Spanish with the possibility of leísmo, of course, but still an accusative subject, and an infinitival verb form. Furthermore, an additional difficulty that Spanish speakers may find in the acquisition of the PIC is that Spanish also has a structure with the sequence the preposition a plus an infinitive. So again, we have here the PIC in Portuguese, but in Spanish, the preposition a appears in a different structure with a different value, the periphrastic future. Here, this preposition does not have an aspectual feature associated. It's an expression of tense. And in Portuguese, the same periphrastic future is similar, but without the preposition, as we can see in the example 9. So we have the verb ir in the present, then an infinitive, but in Spanish, preceding the infinitive, we have the preposition. So this may be an additional difficulty. So to answer the research question, I will present the results from 3 different experimental tasks. First, some notes about the participants in these tasks. So they were divided between 3 different levels of proficiency, A2, B1, and B2. They were all from the same geographic area to avoid dialectical variation. They were learning Portuguese in a formal context, and they acquired Portuguese in adulthood. The participants from the L2 Portuguese groups and the control groups were all in the same age interval, and the control group was constituted by monolingual speakers with no background in linguistics. So the first task was an acceptability judgment task, and the goal here was to test case properties and properties associated with 5 features of the PIC. We had 16 test items divided between 4 conditions, and we will see them in a minute. All the subjects of the embedded domain were third-person plural, pronominal, and human. In this test, the participants were asked to rate a set of sentences using a 4-point Likert scale, 0 to 3, and they also had the option, I don't know. They were also asked to correct the sentences that they rated with 0 or 1, that is, the sentences that they found impossible in Portuguese. And here we have the conditions. So we have 4 conditions, 2 conditions with nominative subjects and 2 conditions with accusative subjects. The conditions with nominative subjects were ungrammatical, so we had a nominative subject plus a prepositional and inflected infinitive, and nominative subject with prepositional inflected infinitive. The grammatical sentences were the ones with accusative subjects, and they corresponded to PIC instances. So we had PIC with an inflected infinitive or PIC with inflected infinitive. Here are the results for the acceptance rates of PIC with an inflected infinitive, and as we can see here, there is a clear contrast between the results of the control group and the Portuguese L2 group. So the green and blue bars correspond to the 3 and 2 points in the Likert scale, so acceptance, and the red and yellow bars correspond to 0 and 1. The control group accepts PIC with rates above 90% if we sum up the 2 and 3, but the Spanish speakers tend to reject this structure in all the proficiency levels, except for the A2 level. Still, we found statistical significant differences between the control group and the A2, B1, and B2 groups. Regarding the PIC with inflected infinitive, we also find a similar contrast between the control group and the Spanish speakers group, although the acceptance rates, even in the control group, are a little bit lower. Still, we find significant differences between the control group and the A2, B1, and B2 groups. So these results give us the first clue towards the difficulty of the Spanish speakers learning Portuguese to acquire this structure. Since we asked for the participants to correct the sentences that they rejected, how did the L2 speakers corrected the PIC structures? The most common corrections corresponded to structures with an accusative subject plus infinitive, that is a configuration of ECM, as in the example, or even dative plus infinitive. We also found grammatical sentences with dative subjects, such as the example shows. So we have here the dative subject and then a prepositional inflected infinitive, and this is not possible. So these types of corrections and the ones with dative plus infinitive indicate that these participants tend to transfer the effects, the properties associated with leísmo and differential object marking from their L1. Plus, Spanish learners did not replace the PIC for the gerund construction in the corrections that they presented. So this may be a clue to a difficulty in the mapping stage, more specifically in the mapping of the spectral feature of the PIC and the gerund construction. The second task that was designed was a sentence completion task. And here we wanted to test the selection of the PIC under perception versus causative verbs. So we wanted to test if these learners acquired the selection properties of these two types of verbs, since the PIC is only possible with perception verbs. We also wanted to test the preference for prepositional versus non-prepositional infinitives and inflected versus uninflected infinitives. And we will this will become clear when I show you the conditions. So we had 16 test items. Sorry, there's a mistake here. There were 8 per condition. There were 2 conditions. The subjects were third person plural, DPs, and human. And here the participants were asked to complete a sentence by choosing between 3 options. And they were informed that they could choose the options that they perceived as possible to complete each sentence. So they could choose 1, 2, or all 3 options. And here we have an example. So first, the first condition was sentences with perception verbs. So we had something like, Maria hired some gardeners to take care of her garden. She saw, and this sentence could be completed with 3 options. The first one was an inflected infinitive complement. The second, PIC with inflected infinitive. And the third, PIC with an inflected infinitive. In the case of the condition with perception verb, all 3 options were correct in Portuguese. Then we had the condition with the causative verb deixou, to let, and here we had something like, Teresa's sisters went to visit her and asked if they could smoke. Teresa let, and again we had the same 3 options, but here only the inflected infinitive complement was the grammatical option. First, we will look into the results for the complement clauses with inflected infinitive. The orange line corresponds to the condition with causative verbs and the blue line to the one with perception verbs. And here we can see that the selection rate of destruction with causative verbs is higher than with perception verbs in all the groups. In the case of the causative verbs, the results of the control group and of the L2 speakers are very similar, and we found no significant differences. In the case of the perception verbs, however, the control group shows lower selection rates. And this can be explained by 2 factors. The first one can be a task effect, because I observed that in the majority of the participants did not select the 3 options even when they were possible. And this is true for the test items and for the distractors. On the other hand, we have seen that the PIC is the preferred complement with perception verbs by Portuguese monolingual speakers. And this is clear here in the results of the PIC with an inflected infinitive. We have higher selection rates with perception verbs in the control group, but in the case of the L2 speakers, the rates are much lower. In the case of the causative verbs, this was a grammatical option, and the selection rates reflect that across the groups. Again, we found no significant differences in the causative verbs, but with the perception verbs, we found differences between the control group and the A2 and B1 groups. As for the PIC with inflected infinitive, as we can see, With the perception verbs here in blue, the selection rates are lower than with the PIC with uninflected infinitive, in the same line of what we found in the acceptability judgment task. Still, the selection rates of the control group and the B2 group are higher than with the A2 and the B1 groups. And in fact, we found significant differences in the condition with perception verb between the control group and the A1 and B1 groups. The final task was a forced choice task. And here the goal was to test the identification of morphological contrasts, the presence or absence of the spectral marker A2. So here we had 12 test items, and the embedded subjects were first person plural and second person singular, pronominal, and human. We asked the participants to fill blanks in a small text by choosing between two different structures as complements of a perception verb, but here only one option was correct, as we can see during the example. So we had the two conditions, one with first person plural and one with second person singular. The participants had sentences like the ones in 12 and 13. Maria saw blank space football, and the two options between that they could choose were one that has an accusative subject plus inflected infinitive, and that is impossible in Portuguese, and one with accusative subject plus a plus inflected infinitive that corresponds to PIC with inflected infinitive. So the only difference between the two options is the presence of the spectral head. Furthermore, the impossible option has some similarities with ECM, since we have an accusative subject and an infinitival verb form, in this case inflected, however. The results of the selection of the correct option, the PIC with inflected infinitive, show a clear contrast between the selection rates of the control group and each of the Spanish speakers groups. So the control group selected the PIC in over 95% of the cases, but the selection rates of the A2, B1, and B2 groups were of 35% or less. And in this case, we found significant differences between the control group and each one of the L2 speakers groups in both conditions. So clearly, in this task, the Spanish learners of Portuguese, when confronted with two options that differ only by the presence or absence of the spectral head, they prefer the option without the spectral head, that is the option that has some resemblance with the structure that is available both in the L1 and the L2 ECM. Now, finally, in this task, we had some control items that tested the periphrastic feature. So we have here only an example, just to simplify. So we had sentences in which the two options that could be chosen were one that has periphrastic features similar to Spanish, that is incorrect in Portuguese. So we have here a periphrastic feature with the preposition. And then we had the correct option in Portuguese, that is a periphrastic feature without the preposition, always with the verb ir to go in the present. The results again show that Spanish speakers have some difficulty and seem to be transferring the properties of their L1 even in the more advanced levels of proficiency. So here we have the B2 group answering at a chance level, and the selection rates of the correct option in Portuguese for the A2 and B1 groups are very low. We found significant differences between the control group and the A2 and B1 groups with the second person singular and in the first person plural with all the L2 speakers groups. So to conclude, I would just show again our research question. And the main conclusions that we can draw from our data is that the 3 experimental tests have shown that Spanish learners of Portuguese struggle to acquire the PIC structure, and this difficulty persists even in more advanced levels of proficiency. It seems that mapping the spectral value associated with the gerund verb form in Spanish to the overt spectral heads a plus infinitive of the PIC seems to be difficult. And even if we consider a unified analysis of the PIC, Spanish speakers seem to struggle with mapping the incorporated spectral marker in the gerund verb form in the L1 with the spelled out spectral marker of the PIC in the L2. And it should be said that this type of task seems to be difficult according to the feature reassembly hypothesis. So the main difficulty in acquiring the PIC for these learners may lie on the combination of the spectral head a plus infinitive and secondly on the inflected infinitive that is possible with the PIC. We also found in the acceptability judgment task some persistent transfer effects of general properties of the L1, namely differential object marking and Leismo. And this is in line with the hypothesis that avoiding L1 features that are not encoded in the L2 may be a complex task. We also hypothesize that Spanish learners may perceive the features and properties of the ECM structure of their L1 as sufficient to account for the Portuguese input. So although Spanish learners show some selection or acceptability patterns similar to the ones of the Portuguese speakers, namely in the fact that they have higher rejection rates of the PIC with inflected infinitive than with an inflected infinitive, we can still observe lingering transfer effects of the property of the L1, even in advanced levels of proficiency. Thank you very much.